Welcome to Curiosity Kick. I'm your host Lee Delaney and this is Season 2. If you're a returning listener, thanks for coming back, and if you're brand new, then thanks for coming on board. Either way, it's really good to have you and hope you enjoy the show. I've had a bit of a longer break with Christmas than I first planned. In the new year, I've been busy with arranging our house move, which will hopefully complete in the next few weeks. I've also gotten a promotion for my day job with a lot of work going into interview and application and that sort of thing. But it helps fund Curiosity Cake, so that's helpful. And I've also started working on creating my own online coaching business. I'll tell you more about that in the future, but if you're listening and you're an introvert who is interested in developing your career and developing yourself, then get in touch to find out more. You can contact me via the usual channels, Curiosity_Cake on Twitter, Curiosity Cake Pod on Instagram, and through the website curiositycake.co.uk. In Season 2 of the podcast, you can look forward to more conversations with fascinating people doing amazing things as I continue to satisfy my curiosity. Do get in touch and let me know if there are topics or people you want me to cover on the show. I'd really love to hear your ideas. And as always, tell your friends, tell your family, tell random people in the street who look like they might need to hear a good podcast. On this episode, I'm talking to Dr Laura Lewandowski from the National Institutes of Health. Laura studies the genetics of autoimmunity in global populations. She has a particular interest in pediatric lupus and understanding the differences in how disease affects patients of different ancestries around the world. But for now, get yourself a cup of tea, grab a fork and dig into a slice of Curiosity Cake. Curiosity Cake. Laura, welcome to Curiosity Cake.
Good morning, Lee. So excited to be on your show today. Such an honor to be here. I'm such a huge fan of your show. In your intro where you say this is a show for curious kids who grow up to be curious adults, I felt like that's me. So just delighted to be here with you.
I think maybe I should do another trailer with you saying that, I think, Laura.
Anytime.
And obviously you like the show so much you actually came back to re-record this after we had a bit of a technical glitch, so thanks very much for doing that.
Oh, my pleasure. If you've gotten through 2020 without a technical glitch, then I don't know who you are, because we're all experiencing them. So my pleasure to be back again.
Great. So Laura, you're not just a practicing doctor, but you're also a kind of scientific researcher as well. You've particular interest in autoimmune disease and rheumatology. So if we can maybe start with just a bit of an explanation of what rheumatology is and autoimmunity.
Sure. So yeah, you got it exactly right. I'm the kind of doctor who has the privilege to do kind of two different things. I see patients in the clinic, and so just like you would go to see your regular doctor for the things that you need to be taken care of, I work in the clinic seeing patients, but then I also have a good part of my work, which is outside of the clinic, where I try to understand more about my patients to help better treat them. And so I'm a pediatric rheumatologist, and rheumatologists study autoimmune diseases. And so what that means is that we have these elegant immune systems, all of us, where they're constantly on the lookout for danger. And mostly that comes in the form of bacteria and viruses or things that can give us infections. And so there's this really beautiful system where they are trolling for danger, and when they find it, they set off a cascade of signals to alert your body and respond to it with inflammation, and hopefully stop the infection and stop it from replicating, and then you get better. But sometimes those signals get mixed up, and so instead of attacking the bacteria or virus, the signal gets mixed up, so you attack part of your body. And there's a wide range of autoimmune diseases, and they kind of can look differently depending on which part of your body is being attacked. And so if you have multiple sclerosis, it's your nervous system. If you have inflammatory bowel disease, it's your GI tract. And So which part of your body is getting attacked kind of depends on certain different factors. But for me, as a rheumatologist, my particular interest is a disease called lupus. And so lupus is what we call a systemic autoimmune disease, which means it's not just in your GI tract or just not in your kidneys or not in your nervous system, any part of your body. It's a kind of a systemic inflammation. So it can look like lots of different things. You can get fevers and rashes, and it certainly, because the inflammatory response is the same as you would get from an infection, it certainly in the beginning can look like a lot of different infections.
It can really range then in terms of the severity of the symptoms, from something that's reasonably mild or you experience in a very inconsistent way to things that are really debilitating and affect your life on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. There's a whole range of symptoms, and some of them are very easy to kind of see and measure. Like some patients have inflammation in their kidneys, and so they have, really bad inflammation in their kidneys that makes them spill blood or protein into their urine, and their kidneys don't work right. And so clearly they're very sick, and there's very obvious signs. But there's other patients who have maybe a little bit of rash or hair loss, and then a lot of fatigue, and things that are a little bit more difficult to measure. Also, patients can have different kind of levels of disease over time. So it can be episodic. The inflammation is most often episodic, where they have periods where the disease is quiet, and periods where the disease is active. And so in the quiet periods, they feel well, they can go about their regular lives, but then they have what we usually call a flare, which just means the inflammation is kind of raising, the levels of inflammation are raising up. And so then the flares can look different at different times. Sometimes it can be in their kidneys, sometimes it can be in their nervous system, sometimes it can be in their skin. So it is a disease that can look different at different times in the same person and can change over time. Sometimes you have the early, really active disease and the chronic disease, which phases can look different too. So it's a pretty complex disease, and it's a little difficult to study for that reason. It's not one thing in one person that looks the same. It kind of can look different at different times.
And that's a real focus of the work that your lab does, really looking at how there are differences across different kind of populations around the world and how autoimmunity affects them.
For sure. So, the thing about lupus is it's a devastating disease. It can certainly be life-threatening, and it definitely, because of the fatigue and the severe organ manifestations, can really change a patient's quality of life, their ability to do the things that they want to do, the ability to do the work that they want to do. And so definitely a high research priority. But also, even though we've known about lupus for a long time, we don't 100% even really understand exactly how it works or who gets it and why. And so there's this kind of balance between, who will get lupus and what will cause those things. Part of it is genetics. We know that because if you are a sibling of somebody who has lupus, you have 26 times the risk of the general population of getting it yourself. And if you're an identical twin, you have a 50% chance of having lupus if your identical twin has lupus. So genetics are certainly playing a role in there, if that's true. But at the same time, it's not all genetics, because if it was all genetics, if your identical twin had it, you would get it 100% of the time, because you share the same genes. And so there's what we call a genetic predisposition, or you have a certain genetic makeup that makes you more likely to get the disease, and then something else comes along and kind of triggers that self-inflammatory cycle that we see in lupus. And that something else could be a lot of different things, and a lot of areas are under investigation. Certainly environmental factors like pollution levels or how much UV light you see. There's a lot of interest in certain viruses being the second signal that kind of tips you over into this disease phase where, if you encounter Epstein-Barr virus and you have a certain kind of genetics, or some other viruses. Recently, I don't know if you've heard anything about the microbiome, but the composition of which bacteria are in your gut can really affect and shape your immune system, and we're learning more and more about that. So that might play a big role. It's kind of we're early in those studies yet, but that could be a possibility. But really, my focus is the genetics. So there's a genetic predisposition, and because I'm a pediatric rheumatologist, I study children, and children with lupus we know are a more severe population. So not only did they get the disease earlier because they're children when they get it, but they have really active disease. It's harder to treat. It takes more medicine. They have more organ damage than adults, even though they don't do all the terrible things that we do to abuse our bodies, like smoking and drinking. And they have young, healthy bodies, but they still have more organ damage. And so they're sicker and they're younger, and so they're the population that's more likely to have a genetic component. And so, thinking about that, it really makes sense to study children when you're thinking about the genetics of lupus. And then beyond that, you mentioned my interest in global populations. I'm not only a rheumatologist, but I'm also a global health doc, and I've done a lot of global health throughout my career working in different places. But it's true that in lupus, it's not only the most severe in children, but it's the most severe in non-white populations. And so I wanted to understand, when I was understanding lupus, if it's more severe in children and more severe in people of African ancestry, what is lupus like in African children? And when I started asking that question, there was actually not a lot known. So there was one paper written almost 15 years ago now about 30 kids in South Africa, and that they were, kind of just saying that we have this collection of patients and they're sick, and more research needs to be done in this area because there's just so little known. And so I formed a collaboration with a really great pediatric rheumatologist who was working in South Africa at the time, Dr. Chris Scott, and he said, I'm taking care of lots of lupus patients, and I would love to, work with you to kind of describe them, because I think they are sicker and have a story that should be shared. So I actually moved to South Africa for 2 years and studied the patients there. Just and the first step was not genetics. It was just understanding, who are these kids? What kind of, because as we talked about earlier, lupus can look like so many different things. So, do they have damage in their kidneys, in their eyes, in their inflammation in their hearts? What is just kind of descriptive? What do they look like? Mm-hmm. So that was like the first couple of years of my work. It was interesting because there was kind of a misconception that lupus didn't happen that frequently in African populations. And it was kind of like a vicious cycle. So there wasn't a lot of doctors around that knew how to diagnose lupus, or if there were doctors who were trained to diagnose it, they didn't have access to the very specific blood tests or x-rays that you need to kind of confirm the diagnoses.
So there was a bit of an issue there of people maybe thought there wasn't that much lupus in Africa, but that was more to do with the resources not being there for people to really discover it.
Exactly. And even in places where there were doctors and lab tests, they might not have the resources to do research, because if you have doctors who are there taking care of patients and, they're diagnosing their lupus and they're treating it, they just might not have dedicated research time or the software or, the kinds of things that you need to do to collect information and then report them in publications, which is how we as a medical community and a scientific community know that the patients are there. But then that problem just kind of gets worse over time, because if you think about places, lower and middle income countries with limited healthcare budgets, if they're looking at how they're going to allocate their money, they're not going to dedicate dollars towards patients or training doctors to take care of patients or to do research on patients that they don't know are there. So as time goes on, less money gets allocated towards those things, and they get recognized less. And meanwhile, those patients are suffering inflammation and damage and impact on their lives. So I really became passionate about not only doing research to understand more about lupus for lupus patients everywhere, but really making the case that when we're missing these populations, we're missing a big part of the story, and maybe a very important part of the story. If you think about where, for pediatrics, where pediatric populations are in the world, 90% of the world's children live in lower and middle income nations, but that's not where we're doing the research most of the time. And so we could understand so much more about the breadth and the range and the impact of these diseases if we were more inclusive in our research. And so that's a big part of what I do, is trying to be inclusive in research. And that is now extended into genetics. So, back to the curious kid kind of theme. As I started to see these patients and see that they were very sick, certainly access to care is a huge part of that, as we talked about limited resources before, but there were patients who just were lucky and got diagnosed at the right time in the right place and got into care right away, and still had very high inflammatory disease that was just really difficult to treat with all the available medications. And so I did start to think that there might be differences in genetic predisposition to severe disease, and so started to think about studying that. And so the next natural question in my pursuit of understanding more about what was going on in the genetics of lupus is to understand the genetics of lupus in global populations. And I really wanted that to include world populations because, if we look at who gets bad lupus in the United States, it's people of African ancestry, it's people of Hispanic ethnicity. And so currently I'm studying the early onset patients who are located in Africa and Mexico, and trying to expand that to more places around the world.
I think, does part of your work then compare the experience of, as you say, Americans with African descent, African ancestry? Are you comparing their experience of lupus and autoimmunity to patients actually in Africa that you were working with?
Absolutely. So, if you want to know if patients are sick or not, you obviously, sick is kind of a relative term, right? So are the patients in Africa sick in comparison to whom? So my very first paper that I wrote about South African children, I collected a cohort of patients there and then did a study where I compared them to a very big cohort in the United States to see, were they sicker than the patients in general? Were the African patients sicker than the African patients in the U.S.? So, the African patients in Africa are sicker than the African patients in the U.S. So from a disease standpoint, that's pretty easy. From a genetic standpoint, it gets trickier because what we know about genetics, it's such an exciting time to be doing genetics. We're kind of in this golden age where we have all these technologies where we can sequence, conduct an analysis of somebody's whole genome, which 20 years ago might have taken years and now takes weeks.
And probably a huge amount of money as well.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's like a lot of things in engineering where it's hugely costly at the beginning where you kind of figure it out. But then as time goes on, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as people figure out how to do it quicker and still keep the quality. So it's actually not that expensive to do that anymore. And so we have this huge amount of data. But when genetic studies were started, they were started in the United States and Europe. And so we have a whole bunch of information on European populations. So, and the reference genomes initially were largely European ancestry. And so it matters in genetic studies because the way that you look for changes in genes, which might lead to changes in proteins, which might cause disease, is you have references, which are healthy people, and then you compare the sequences of your patients with disease to those healthy people who are the references. And if you're, changes in genes can be very specific to your genetic ancestry. So if you have an entirely African population and you're comparing to a European population as a reference, lots of things are going to look different, and they're probably not different because of disease. They're probably different because of just genetic diversity. And so we're really kind of in the infancy of trying to make our references more diverse. I think there's huge pushes now. There's some amazing people here at the NIH doing a project called H3 Africa, where they're trying to collaborate with Africans in Africa to create a reference data set that is applicable to their populations, especially because Africans are the oldest population. Their genetic ancestry is just so incredibly diverse. So you can't do a study in South Africa and then do a study in East Africa and compare them as apples to apples. They're just hugely different. So it gets tricky pretty quickly, but also really important, because if we're going to understand, again, the sickest patients and what's driving the disease in the sickest patients, which might be important to patients all over the world, then we need to really get better at being inclusive in genetic studies.
So how do you go about making those comparisons? So I guess there's two levels there. You're talking about the kind of sickness, the manifestation of the disease itself, and making comparisons there, but then making comparisons at the genetics level. It sounds incredibly complicated to pull out all of those additional kind of factors that might affect the level that something is affecting someone. So how do you go about kind of untangling all of that?
It is hugely complicated, and that's kind of why I love it.
You like the challenge of a good puzzle?
I'm a puzzle. I love puzzles and I love problem solving, and I kind of gravitate towards complexity. Like lupus is one of the most complex autoimmune diseases, and genetics is a really complex scientific field. So I think that's kind of what draws me into it. But, it's incredibly complicated. Like if I took your genome and sequenced it and wrote all of the letters A, T, C, G on a piece of paper, the sequence would reach from here to the moon. Mm-hmm. And we all have changes in our genome, and most of them don't cause disease. They give you your father's eyes and your mother's nose, and they don't cause any problems at all. So finding the changes that cause problems is actually really, really tricky, and really is at the heart of what I do. Because really what you try to do is take patients with disease and maybe similar types of disease, like a group of patients that all have kidney disease. And the first thing you do is to see if two unrelated people have changes in the same gene, because that might be a really big signal that is important. So if I have a patient who lives in the US and a patient who lives in Africa, and they both have changes in the same gene, which changes the same protein, but they're not related to each other, that might be an important one. Another thing that really helps, and is another great reason to study children with disease, is if you look at parents that are healthy and children who have the disease, if the change is in the child and not in the parent, that's a lot more likely to be something that's related to disease and not just something you got from your mom or dad. That gets trickier in adults because, if you're studying somebody who's 50 or 70, their parents may or may not be around to get DNA from for comparison. So it really helps when you're studying children to figure that out. And then there's all sorts of, this is the field of genetics is exploding right now with different algorithms which help you prioritize and sort and decide. But there's still, to be completely honest, in genetics, there's way more that we don't know than what we do know, because we've just kind of had this technology in our hands. Like, it's an incredible time for discovery because we have this new technology, but only 2 to 3% of our genome codes for proteins, and the rest of it doesn't make proteins. It either makes it turns up the volume or turns down the volume on certain proteins at certain times. So, it's what we call like regulatory elements. So say you have a gene that makes a protein that regulates inflammation. And if you're just walking around healthy, you don't want a lot of inflammation. You just want a low level. So it kind of, your regulatory element keeps it low.
Do we always have some level of inflammation?
Yeah, we do. But usually, it's kind of, those genes are pretty quiet if we're walking around healthy. Then a virus comes along and our body senses it. And then, all of a sudden those regulatory elements turn on the gas and ramp things up, and we fight off the virus, and then they turn on the brake. And there's all these beautiful feedback loops that kind of regulate these things. So we're understanding more about those. There's also just parts of the gene, like non-coding RNA that we're just starting to discover and understand. So there's tons and tons to learn, and there's a lot of information there, and we're figuring out as we go how to use it. So it's exciting, and we have rich data sets to work with, and you could really just analyze things in 15 different ways. But hopefully, if you look with different lenses, you start to hone in on the things that are really important, which, if you think about, there's a lot of talk right now about personalized medicine or precision medicine, where you understand, which patients have certain types of disease so that you can give them the right medicine. So it's targeted, so they're not having a medicine that's kind of like, if you think about the medicines we use in autoimmunity, we have something called steroids or glucocorticoids, which are great at stopping inflammation. But it's like, putting a blanket over a fire. They're not specific at all. They just kind of put out the inflammation, but they have all these other side effects that our patients hate. And so if we understand more about the proteins in the inflammatory pathway, and we can target the right proteins in the right people, hopefully we keep that precision of turning off the inflammation in the cells and the people where it's causing a problem, and not doing other things which cause side effects. So we keep people feeling well on medicines that don't bother them in other ways. That's really the goal, and ultimately working towards a cure. So, right now, lupus is a chronic disease. It's a success story from a treatment standpoint, because, back in the day when lupus was first being reported in children in the 30s and 40s and 50s, it was a fatal disease. Like if you had it, then it was rapidly fatal within 5 years. But then we discovered steroids could treat it, and then we discovered other medicines can treat it. And so now in the US, 99% of kids with lupus survive at 5 and 10 years. It's great, but they still have to take medicines every day, and some of the medicines have not so great side effects. So now the goal is to work towards medicines that make them feel great without side effects, and well, if we work towards a cure, because these are lifelong diseases, then they could be off medicines and feel great.
And what do you think are the chances of finding a total cure for it?
Oh, it's hard to say. I'm not the only person working on it, and a lot of smart people have been working on it for a very long time. But, I do have a lot of hope. I think even in my lifetime, I've seen amazing medicines come down the line, and really amazing scientific advancement in the understanding of the disease. So, when I talk to my patients and they're struggling, with the unpredictability of the disease, or just the fact that, it is really difficult to be a teenager in general, but then to be a teenager with a chronic disease on top of it, that is a really hard thing. And I have a huge amount of respect for what they do every day, just, managing those things. But I always tell them that I have a lot of hope, because I've seen a lot of great things happen just in the time that I've been doing this work. And I have hope for more great things to come. And I'd love to be a part of the change. I'd love to discover something that made my patients feel better. They absolutely deserve it.
Well, you're certainly very well placed to do that, aren't you? Because it seems very important that there are people that have that contact with the patients, but who are also doing that research because they understand the human side of the disease rather than just the kind of theoretical side of it.
Yeah, I think it really is such a privilege to be able to do the kind of work where I go into the clinic and I talk to the patient. And so when I'm doing my data analyses, I'm not just looking at spreadsheets of kind of, I'm thinking about the people behind those. And really, it is hugely motivating, because, science is hard, and, there's a lot of long days where nothing goes right.
A lot of long days while you're waiting for like R or Python or something to work through.
The eureka days where you hold up your test tube in the lab are just few and far between. And a lot of it is really getting up with just dedication to doing a lot of hard things. But what keeps me going in those moments is that, I think about my patients who are also doing way harder things than the things that I'm doing. and they can't take days off. They don't get to decide, like, I get a day off from it. They have lupus every day. And right now we don't have enough medicines to treat all the problems that lupus causes. So until that's not true, I'm going to be getting up and going back and doing those hard things because it needs to get better.
Definitely. And such a, kind of brave thing to be involved in, because there is that emotional element to it where you're seeing the people that are affected by the disease doing that research work. And I think that's a difficult thing, is you have that emotional attachment to what's going on, which I imagine puts a lot of pressure on you as well, because you can see the effects the disease is having in someone. You have that kind of natural human response of wanting to try to do something about it to alleviate someone's suffering.
Yeah, I mean, it does put a lot of pressure, but I think it puts the best kind of pressure. It gives my work incredible meaning. If I was just doing this, I'm obviously, would be interested in scientific questions. And I did research before I was a doctor, and I was still very interested in answering the questions and solving the problems. But, it gives such a beautiful meaning to every day that I think really, everybody wants their work to have purpose, and I can't imagine a better purpose than this. And, I've always been the type of person that, if I know that there are people out there in the world, then I want to be doing something about it. It's why I became a pediatrician. It's not easy to see sick kids, but if there are sick kids, then I want to be somebody who knows what to do about it. And the same thing with global health. Like, I take my job as a researcher very seriously, but also I see my research as advocacy, because people don't really know the full extent of who's out there suffering with these diseases. And I now know, because I've gone there and seen it myself, that they're out there. And so if they're out there, I want to be doing something about it. And so that's kind of just been how I've operated all along, and it continues to be something that drives me, but I see it in a positive way. That emotional kind of impact to the work makes it so much more rich and meaningful to me. And I can walk those worlds. I can go into the clinic and see the patients, and then go into the lab and do the experiments knowing who it's for. And that's great.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'm really interested in the work that you do, particularly on that global level, is your experience of being a white American woman going to Africa as a doctor, trying to help people there, with this condition. And there are examples of people. We recently had a situation in Britain where there's a kind of documentary filmmaker, journalist in the UK who makes things for TV, and as part of a kind of charity that we have here, she was involved in doing stuff in Africa. Can't remember exactly what it was she was doing, but she was getting criticized as being like the white savior. Here's another white person going to save the Africans, which to me just seems like very unfair. So I'm just wondering, what kind of experience do you have as, like I say, a white American that goes to Africa doing this kind of research and this kind of medical work?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and one that I try to be mindful of as I do this work, because as true in those cases where there has been criticism, I think some of the criticism is founded, and I'm not, as a white American doctor, I think that I've never seen myself as flying into these places with like a superhero cape doing work that nobody else could do. And probably if I had, I'd be dismissed very quickly. I've always gone in as a partnership and a collaboration with brilliant doctors doing important work, and I'm just there to help. I'm there as an extra piece of the puzzle. And so when I started to do global health work, it was in areas that didn't have pediatricians. So, I came in with a specific skill set that was needed and could work with amazing doctors. I mean, the doctors that work in these places have limited resources, and they have learned over their lifetimes to do amazing medicine with less than we have ever done. And so I feel like in some ways they have a skill set that teaches me a lot. I've always learned more than I've given in every environment that I've gone into. And showing up with a spirit of collaboration and not savior, no sense of saving the day, I think is important. And it's important to build something that benefits the people and the patients there first and foremost. So when I got to South Africa to study lupus patients, I didn't go and set up a research lab and sit with my computer in the corner, doing research. I showed up on the first day and rolled up my sleeves and spent the first 6 months just seeing patients as a doctor, because that's what was needed. And I needed to understand the system and how it worked and what they were doing and what the challenges were.
You were providing a service then that wasn't existing in the areas you were in. So, so you were actually able to offer something that wasn't there before. At the same time, the kind of local doctors there were able to learn from you, but you're also learning from them. So it's very much a on-the-ground collaborative approach.
Yeah, I mean, I can't research something if I don't understand first how it works and who's going to teach me, except for the doctors who are there doing the work. And it was also important, I thought, these patients have never seen me before. I have a funny accent. It's important for them to get to know me before I start, in talking to them about research or this foreign thing that, and so I came in first as their doctor to understand them and get to know them, and then, build a research collaboration with them as a partnership too, because I think patients are very important partners in the research, just as the doctors there are. And so, we built a research registry, we built some infrastructure. And again, what I brought was time and resources. So, I had the software, I had the capacity, I had the training to do this research. And so the doctors there who were seeing patients could now participate in research, which they didn't have the time or the specific things at their institution to do. And so, that is total teamwork, and it 100% wouldn't, zero of it would happen without them, because they needed to show me how everything worked and help me get things up and running. And it's still true today. It's a true collaboration and partnership. And as I continue to work with other places, that's totally my mindset. And I think, building great relationships, it's one of the great joys of science is building great collaborations. You meet people and you start rolling up your sleeves and working alongside each other, and then you get to know each other professionally and you build up these great friendships. And, because of the scientific work that I do, I have friends all over the globe that I never would have imagined, when I was a kid, growing up, I never would imagine that I would have really dear friends in Kenya and South Africa and Vietnam and the UK and just everywhere. It's amazing and wonderful. And so, I think having that mindset, but also being mindful of really important things. So, there's a term in global health about global health colonialism, where you have to make sure you're not just going in and tapping an untapped resource and getting all the glory for this. How are you building collaborations? Whose names are going on the papers? Who's getting to do the important parts of the work? Are you engaging with people in that teamwork, providing them a service and they provide you a service? Is it a fair exchange? And then are you leaving space and room for them to grow and develop as their own scientists? I really would love to get my collaborations to a place where they don't need me anymore. They've got the infrastructure, and then they get some training through grants or whatever, and then they're able to just do things on their own. Great. Wonderful. That would be my dream come true. Amazing that I would be able to be a part of building up a research capacity so that, brilliant doctors and scientists in those places could really be fully engaged and be leading that work. I think that would be a great success. And I only go in as a teammate to kind of get that ball rolling, because I know in resource limited settings, some of the research infrastructure just isn't there, and they won't be able to start that kind of snowball. There's not funding or infrastructure there to do it. But once it gets going, they can run with it. I hope,
How much are you able to support that infrastructure side, or is it something that you just have to kind of stand back and watch and hope it develops?
Yeah, it really depends on the site. So in South Africa, I wrote grants specifically for the site development there. And then have, after, I transitioned to my current role here, I have done more of the support side where, I alert them to funding and I help, review proposals and things of that nature. So it really varies on the site. But, I can always offer guidance and expertise and input to kind of help people who are interested in doing this kind of work be successful in getting some funding started, and also give them, our experience in South Africa is really more easily translatable to other resource limited settings. So I can say, hey, here's real world, like this is what we did. You can have all of our, database or RedCap or whatever, so that they're not the next person that starts isn't starting as much from scratch. And so that also really helps.
What were the biggest challenges for your work in Africa beyond the issue of resources and the infrastructure?
So, I think that the challenges were a few, and they were varied. So first, the challenges of just working in a place where there's a lot of difficulty with poverty and access to care. So, whether or not a patient could come see me on a day really depends on how far away that they live and the traffic and the accidents. And, in South Africa, there's not good public transportation. And so, it can be a long and dangerous journey. So that's had a big impact on kind of in research and patient care, to be honest. And we really did work to try to optimize that for patients. And then beyond that, just kind of working in a place where you didn't grow up. So, there's lots of things that there's lots of, it's cultural. Like we all have a different culture and there's a lot of rules that people can tell you, but then there's a lot of stuff that's just unwritten. And so I think, navigating cultural differences and understanding that even if you're a super nice person who is walking, you might just be doing things that people think are strange, or, like it's going to take some time for people to trust you. So at the beginning, when I would need to get access to medical records, I would go in with my badge and I would talk to the people, and they would just kind of be wary of me, and they would, like just, they would be like, okay, you need those records, leave that over there and we'll look for it later, and then like after 6 months of me going in every day and talking to them and getting to know them, they kind of got to know me, and that I wasn't just like some weird American who showed up for a day to do something, you know what I mean? They got to know me and know what I was about and understand my project. And so I think, there's nothing that rushes that trust building. Like you can't fake it and you can't expedite it. Like it just needs to happen over time. And I think I might have underestimated that because, South Africa, even though they're a resource limited nation, they have a very sophisticated medical system and they speak English. And so a lot of the things that I had encountered in some of the other places I worked globally just seemed like it would be greased wheels in South Africa, but there's still a cultural difference and a divide that I probably underestimated when I first set up the project. But, we got there eventually, and I formed great relationships with everybody there. And now when I go back, it's like a homecoming, like I run into people and at home and at work, and I'm delighted to see them. And when it's not a global pandemic, give them huge hugs, all of that stuff. So, those things take time. Which
comes to the obvious question of how much of an impact is COVID having on your work at the minute?
Oh man, it's probably the impact it's having on everybody's work. It's been a huge impediment and challenge for 2020. I had plans to travel to 2 different research sites this year that got obviously squashed. And then just kind of maintaining relationships. In some ways, like in global health, I've had a long history of doing a lot of like Zooming or teleconferencing long before this year. So that some of that infrastructure was in place, and now it's kind of the way that everybody does everything. So it's a little bit easier to catch up with collaborators or things like that. But, it really had to do some pivots and rethink some things. And, also trying to understand the interaction between immunity and autoimmunity and COVID. That's a huge question. And, thinking about that without, totally redirecting my research into just that has been a balance too. So it's been a challenging year, but, I think, again, there's an upside and a downside. There's great challenges and plans were changed, but I was also able to, have a little, because I wasn't traveling as much, have a little bit more time to do some deep dives of my data just by the fact that I was forced to sit still for once. So, it hasn't been a cloud with no silver lining for sure.
Yeah. So where do you see research around lupus and autoimmunity going in the future?
Yeah, so I think that, right now what we're kind of transitioning into in a lot of autoimmune diseases is understanding groups of diseases from how they looked clinically and symptomatically, and getting more into, because we do have this power to understand the genetics and the science behind things. People will start to be in that precision medicine phase where we it's not just patients who have rashes and kidney problems and fevers get all called lupus. The patients who we understand the molecular problem in certain cells make lupus patients with a certain protein mutation sick in one way, and then another molecular problem sick in a different way, and we'll start to be classifying them a little bit more with a sophisticated scientific lens, and then be able to more precisely treat and manage and make them feel a whole lot better with less side effects. So that's my hope for the next 20 years, is we really kind of shake up our classifications and get a lot more sophisticated with it. And I think we're just at the precipice of that. It's a hugely exciting time to be a part of that effort.
Yeah, it's a really exciting area, and hopefully something that really develops the way you're thinking there. Maybe you can come back and tell us how that develops.
Give you the follow-up story.
Yeah, definitely. So Laura, I think this is a really good time to stop. That was really fascinating. I'm sure people listening will have really enjoyed it and really want to find out more about your work. So where can people check you out?
Sure. So, I work at the National Institutes of Health, and I have a lab page on, if you go to the National Institutes of Health to NIAMS, NIAMS, you can search for me, Dr. Laura Lewandowski, and find out more about kind of the nerdier side of the science that I do. And then just kind of more general scientific interests and lupus advocacy. You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is at Laura Lew Mad 11. And so that's a great place to kind of just follow up and catch up on some of the more general scientific stuff and lupus research that I do. Yeah, so it's really been so great to talk to you. Thank you so much for having me on the show today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Laura. Thanks very much for taking the time out from the really important work that you're doing. And everyone, check out Laura's Twitter, check out her scientific details, which will also be in the show notes for everyone that wants to find out more. Laura, it's been really good fun, really interesting topic, really important topic. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Remember to rate and review the show on your podcast app and spread the word. And get in touch on Twitter or through the website or Instagram. Let me know what topics you'd like to hear in the future. Bye for now.
Curiosity Cake.